In this video, we're going to be looking at pathogens, which are, the average person calls them germs. These are the things that make us sick. They cause infectious diseases and they disturb homeostasis. And the different types of pathogens we have, bacteria and viruses mostly, but there's also unicellular eukaryotes, there's parasitic worms and things of that nature. This is an example. This is something called Helicobacter pylori. It's a bacteria, H. pylori for short. And H. pylori we now know causes stomach ulcers. We used to think that stomach ulcers were caused by having too much stress in your life or having excess acid because you're eating too many spicy foods or things of that nature. We now know actually that this bacteria lives in the mucosal lining that protects the stomach. And in some people, for reasons we don't fully understand, their immune system responds to the presence of that bacteria, tries to destroy the bacteria. But because the bacteria is inside the mucosal lining, inside the stomach, the immune system tries to get at this bacteria from the outside in and causes the stomach ulcers from the outside into the stomach. In a short moment, I'm going to be talking about something called Koch postulates, which is how scientists determine that a particular disease is caused by a particular pathogen. And the story behind this is pretty interesting. How did a medical doctor prove, using Koch postulates, that this bacteria was actually causing the stomach ulcers? A picture of what an ulcer looks like in the stomach and in the duodenum, the first segment of the small intestine. And again, we used to think these were caused by just having too much acid in the stomach. We now know they're actually caused by the immune system from the outside in. Different types of pathogens. There are bacteria and viruses, fungal infections, parasitic infections, and protozoans. I want you to circle these two. I want you to realize that the vast majority of us, especially since we live in a first world society where we're not exposed to a lot of parasitic infections and so forth, and amoebic dysentery and those kinds of things, the vast majority of us, when we get infections, is going to be a bacteria and a virus, and usually actually it's a viral infection. Colds, flus, things like that. We're going to look at some examples of pathogens. This one here is a virus, and this is one I mentioned in the last video, is the H5N1. This is the bird flu. And we mentioned the fact that if you look at the surface of the virus, it has a number of different proteins, and that's because it's able to infect different types of cells, the gastrointestinal tract cells of a bird and the upper respiratory systems of a human. So there's a virus that's a pathogen. Here's an example of a unicellular protozoan. And so this is actually a little worm that you can see how big it is relative to one of our red blood cells. And there's a unicellular eukaryotic cell, and it actually causes something called African sleeping sickness. Here's another one. This is malaria. This is a unicellular eukaryote. Technically, it's called an apicomplexan, and it's kind of interesting because it's a parasitic infection, causes malaria, but it's actually vectored to us. It's spread to us by another parasite, the mosquito. Another parasite. This is a tapeworm. Obviously, you can see the tapeworm inside this person's bowel. So how do you prove that pathogens are actually what cause sickness? Because for a long time, scientists didn't know that. Pathogens are really small. Viruses and bacteria are very small. And so people thought that it was evil spirits or, something like that that was making you sick. Well, the way that we prove that a disease, an infectious disease, is actually caused by a particular pathogen, suspected pathogen, is we use what's called Koch postulates. So the first thing is that the pathogen should always be found in a sick organism and never in a healthy organism. Number two, the pathogen must be isolated, grown in pure culture in the lab. So you have to isolate it from a sick individual, grow it in the lab. So that's what they're doing here. Then you have to inject that pathogen into a healthy individual and cause the same disease. Then you have to be able to re-isolate that pathogen from the sick individual. So I mentioned that Koch postulates played a role with the discovery of H. pylori causing stomach ulcers. So here's the deal. Here's the kind of a story for you. The doctor that first suspected that H. pylori was causing these infections suspected that because in all of his patients that had stomach ulcers, he would find this bacteria present. He wouldn't find it in his healthy individuals, but in the mucus of his sick individuals, he'd find it. And so he started thinking, well, this might be what's causing the infection. Now, the medical establishment at the time laughed at him. They thought, no, this is impossible. Nothing can survive in the stomach. And if you think of why that is, why would bacteria not be able to survive in the stomach? It's because it's so acidic. So he said, look, we know that bacteria can't even live in the stomach, let alone cause infections in the stomach. So, the medical establishment thought it was stress and too many spicy foods. And so people that have ulcers, they put them on very bland diets and things like that. So this doctor wanted to prove that this pathogen was actually causing stomach ulcers. So the first thing he had to do was he had to grow it in the lab. And that was the hard part, because trying to recreate the mucosal lining of a stomach in the lab was a very difficult task for him, but eventually he was able to grow it in the lab. Now the part where he has to inject into a healthy patient. What did he do? He drank a bunch of it, gave himself a stomach ulcer, isolated the bacteria from himself, and then he even went the next step, which was he then took antibiotics and treated his infection and removed his stomach ulcer. It really upset his wife because he gave himself a bleeding ulcer, but it did win him a Nobel Prize. So kind of a cool story there of a real-life example of Koch postulates. Reservoir is where is the pathogen coming from? So where are we getting this infectious agent? So animals can actually give us diseases. Rats will vector plague to us. They carry the plague. Ticks carry Rocky Mountain spotted fever as well as Lyme disease. Mosquitoes can vector malaria to us. And birds are the sources of flu. We mentioned that in the other video. Objects, we'll skip humans for a second. Objects, you can get certain infectious diseases from soil, food, water, etc. Make a note down here. I want you to write tetanus. You probably maybe have gotten a tetanus shot. And when do you get a tetanus shot? It's when you've been cut with something rusty. And the reason for that is because the pathogen that causes tetanus is found in nature on rusty metal. This one is the big one. Humans are the main reservoir for each other. If you want to kind of simplify that in your own words, make a little note. What this means is when you get sick, most of the time you get sick, it's because you come in contact with another sick person. Right? The vast majority of us, as we go through life, when we get sick with a cold, a flu, whatever, it's because we've come in contact with some other sick person. Now, the word carrier should look familiar to you. We use this word in the genetics unit when we were talking about genetically caused disorders, disorders that were caused by recessive genes. And we looked at the fact that for a recessive disorder, to have the disorder, you must be like little h, little h. And we talked about the fact that somebody that's healthy and is like that, homozygous dominant, can't have a child, but this person was a carrier, meaning that they were healthy, but they were carrying around the bad gene, if you will, and if they had a child with somebody else that was also a carrier, then potentially you could have two healthy children that have a child with the disorder. So that's where that term carrier has been used before. Well, now we're looking at not a genetic disease, but we're going to be looking at an infectious disease. So this is an individual that is symptom-free, they're healthy, but they are carrying around with them the pathogen. And so one famous example is a woman named Typhoid Mary. And she was a cook in rich people's homes, but unbeknownst to her, she was carrying around the bacteria that causes typhoid fever. And because she was preparing people's food, she infected and killed a number of people. Another example you might think of a carrier is a man like Magic Johnson, who has HIV virus and yet is perfectly healthy. He's had the virus for, I think, like 30 or 40 years now, and yet he's a healthy guy. He appears to be symptom-free, but potentially he could pass on that pathogen to other people. Speaking of passing on pathogens, how are pathogens transmitted to us? Well, they can be through a vector, like malaria. So malaria is the parasitic infection that is actually spread to people through the bite of a mosquito. So the mosquito bites someone with the infection, becomes infected itself, and then when it bites the next healthy person, it transmits malaria to them. The next three, notice, all involve human contact. Remember I mentioned that usually when we get sick, it's from contact with another sick person, right? That we're the main reservoirs for each other. So let's look at how that can work. Direct contact. You have, a handshake, a hug, a kiss, etc., right? Just physically coming into contact with another person. The more intimate the contact, obviously, the more likely the transmission of some kind of disease. Then you have indirect contact through the air and through an object. So when you sneeze, what happens is you're expelling tiny particles of the mucus that's in your upper respiratory tract, and those little drops of mucus might have a virus or bacteria in it, and if somebody breathes that in, then that drop of mucus is going to go into their upper respiratory tract, and then they potentially might get that same infection. So that's indirect contact through the air. Someone sneezes in this classroom, doesn't cover their mouth, potentially you might be breathing in their snot, essentially. Indirect contact through an object. When you sneeze, everyone thinks, you cover your mouth, but really covering your mouth with your hand is not ideal because then the pathogen is just on the hand. So imagine somebody sneezes in this classroom, they cover their mouth and their nose with their hand, and then on the way out the door, they push the door open. Then you come along and push the door open with your hand. Now the pathogen's gone from in their respiratory tract to the air, to their hand, to the doorknob, to your hand. Later on in the day, you touch your face, and now the pathogen's entered your body. So these are the main ways in which we get infections. There are others, contaminated water and stuff, but these are the main ways. If you're wondering how bacteria and viruses or other parasites hurt you, essentially what they do is they destroy you on a cellular level. They're actually damaging cells, and as the damaged cells, number increases, you can have organ failure and potentially even death. So, viruses, as we looked at in another video, we know how they replicate. Well, they're either going to leave, one at a time through exocytosis, and as they do so, they're going to be kind of bleeding the cell dry, or they can actually build up inside the cell until the point where the cell lyses, and you get this massive release of these viral particles, which then go on to infect the next cell. But the whole point is they've killed this cell, and they're going to move on and infect other cells, and that damages the body. Bacteria, on the other hand, they produce harmful chemicals called exotoxins, and that actually helps to damage the cell, and they live off of the nutrition that comes out of the cell as they're breaking it down. And that causes damage to the body, obviously. Because pathogens are a serious health concern, we have government organizations like the CDC and the World Health Organization that help to monitor disease patterns. They've created 3 sort of categories of disease. The first is called endemic. These are diseases that are always around but in small amounts in a population. Make a little note on here that this varies depending on what part of the world you're in. So for example, in Solana Beach, what's something that's endemic to Solana Beach? Well, the common cold. The cold is always around. There's pretty much all year long somebody that's got a cold. But if you go to other parts of the world, like in Africa, an endemic disease there might be malaria. It's just around, maybe yellow fever, maybe, maybe like amoebic dysentery. So it just depends, right, on what part of the world you're in as far as what is endemic to that region. Little side note, the reason why we don't have malaria endemic here is not because we're so great. It's just because we don't have a lot of mosquitoes that carry it because of the temperature and the climate. So more tropical places tend to have more issues with that because they have a better breeding ground for mosquitoes. Epidemic. Epidemic is now we have a large outbreak in an area. I remember a couple of years ago we had, it was just, the flu, which is kind of an endemic disease in San Diego County, Solana Beach. But we had so many cases of the flu at Santa Fe that our nurse had to notify the county health office that, hey, we've got essentially an epidemic of flu at Santa Fe. And I forget what the number of students was, but it was, so many students out with the flu that we had to actually report it. So it can be a large outbreak in an area. It doesn't have to be, that was just Santa Fe Christian. Now, of course, at the time, it was the flu season, and so you could have said that, the flu was epidemic in San Diego County. You might have an epidemic that affects a whole state or a whole country, or potentially, if it gets bad enough, it graduates to a pandemic. So this is an epidemic, but over a large, vast area. The last pandemic we had, of course, was the swine flu, which infected people all over the earth. And there's been other ones before that, bird flu and so forth. The last lethal pandemic was called the Spanish flu, and it would happen in 1918 to 1920. And the reason why people were concerned with the swine flu that just recently happened is that it was actually the same kind of virus as this particularly deadly flu. This deadly flu went from birds to pigs, and then from pigs to people. And it was the flu that circulated during these flu seasons. And it was actually so bad that it stopped. If you think about what was happening in the time, what was going on in the world at this time, well, World War I was going on, and this disease was so bad, it was killing people so quickly, and actually it targeted the young for reasons we don't have to get into. People in their 20s that should have been healthy were the ones that were actually the most likely to die from this particular flu. And it was actually so bad that it stopped World War I during the 2 flu seasons. And it killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people worldwide. And if you think about it, that's an amazing range. Why such a huge range? Well, because people were dying so fast that in a lot of places, societies kind of started to unravel a little bit. A lot of police officers either didn't show up to work, or like in this picture, they showed up wearing masks. A lot of nurses and doctors wouldn't show up to work because they were afraid of getting sick with this deadly flu. People were being buried in mass graves, actually dug by prisoners because nobody else wanted to come in contact with the dead for fear of getting infected. So this was a very, lethal. This was the last time there was a lethal pandemic. Remember, most of our infections that we're going to get are going to be caused by bacteria or viruses. Now, this is something I just want you to know. Only bacteria can be treated with antibiotics. If you get a viral infection, there are a couple antiviral medications that we have, but for the most part, your body's got to just handle that on its own.
And the reason I tell you that is because I want you to know, like if you get a cold or a flu, do not go to your doctor and, badger them until they give you an antibiotic, because overuse of antibiotics has caused us a problem. Let's talk about antibiotics and a world without them, and then look at resistance. So in a world without antibiotics, every cut that you get is a potentially life-ending injury because it has the potential to get infected, and there'll be nothing to treat that infection. Things that we consider kind of minor today, like pulling a tooth, well, that creates a wound that could be infected. Getting an ear infection, all these types of things are now major deals without antibiotics. The first antibiotic was actually discovered completely by accident by Alexander Fleming. So this man was kind of a lazy, sloppy scientist. He had in his, I believe it was just like in his apartment in New York or something like that, he had all these petri dishes around his office, his place where he was working, and he didn't have the lids on them. He was growing bacterial cultures, but he didn't bother with the lids because, it takes a little time to take the lid off and then inspect your colonies and then put the lid back on, so he just didn't have the lids. And a little spore from a fungus landed in one of his petri dishes, which blew in through an open window and landed in the open petri dish. And what was interesting was he noticed that there was a region where the fungus was growing and the bacteria weren't growing. Now, he might have been a little bit lazy, but he was actually a really good scientist in that he noticed, well, that's odd, and he investigated what was going on, and it turned out that this fungus, called penicillium, was producing a chemical called penicillin, which impedes and destroys bacteria. It actually punches holes in the cell wall. And this was the first antibiotic that was discovered. Now, I told you, Alexander Fleming might be, a bit of a lazy scientist, but he was a very good scientist in a lot of ways. And one of the things that was interesting about him was he predicted correctly that, hey, we better be careful how we use these antibiotics, because the more we use them, the more we're going to be selecting for the resistant ones. And in the decades since, we've actually way overused antibiotics. In fact, most people don't know this, but most antibiotics are actually used for cows and chickens and pigs and things like in agriculture. So we way overuse antibiotics. We put a lot of them out in the environment, and that is selecting for resistant strains of bacteria. Today, about 70% of the bacteria that cause infections in hospitals are resistant, and some organisms are essentially resistant to all antibiotics. And this is a growing problem that scientists are really now starting to have to take a strong look at. And essentially, the best solution, at least at this point, is combinations of antibiotics and hopefully developing new antibiotics. But something interesting there for you to know, only bacteria can be treated with antibiotics. For sure, you need to know that. One easy way to remember that, think about the fact that it's anti-bio, anti-life. Well, viruses aren't alive, so they're not going to work against them. They're working against bacterial life. So that's the end of kind of the scary stuff. We talk about all the different pathogens that are trying to make us sick, and now we're going to transition and look at how is our body fighting off these infections, because our body actually does a pretty amazing job at that. I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you next time.